Well, we're going through the life of David on Sunday evenings. He'd been told many years before that he would eventually become the king of Israel, and God had anointed him to that end. He'd patiently waited for the present king Saul to die, and when he died, David expected to become king there and then. But it wasn't to be, for the general of Saul's army, Abner, decided to put Saul's remaining son, Ishbosheth, on the throne. And so for a time, David only ruled over the tribe of Judah. And this brought about civil war between those who wanted Ishbosheth to be king and those who wanted David to be king. And the longer the conflict went on, David's side got stronger and stronger, and the other side got weaker and weaker. Last time, at the beginning of chapter 3, we saw how that David's family had started to grow. He'd wrongly married 6 wives, and each wife had a son, and 3 of his sons turned out really bad and would cause David a lot of trouble in the future. This was the first sign of David's great weakness in life, that of women. Eventually it would spoil his life altogether. Perhaps this is one of the reasons why God made him wait another 7 years for Israel's throne, because he sinned in taking these wives. You see, God said in Psalm 81, "Oh, that my people would walk in my ways, then I should soon have subdued their enemies." In the matter of these wives, David had not walked in God's ways, so his enemies were not soon subdued. But why did David marry so many wives when God had forbidden it and only given 1 wife to Adam in the first place? Was it his pride to think that all these women would bear his name? Or was it the desire to have a lot of children so that he'd be well looked after when he was old? Or was it just lust? Did he really love all these women? Surely if he'd really loved just one of them, then perhaps he'd have been happy with that one. But the fact that he had 6 suggests that he wasn't really fully satisfied with any of them. And 6 was not to be the final number of women that David married, far from it. Later on in the 5th chapter, he marries even more. You see, it's a fallacy, this idea that you can satisfy somebody by giving them a lot of what they want. You can't. It only makes them want more. And once you go against your conscience in a certain matter, your conscience won't convict you as much the second time, and even less the third time, and so on. Why are so many Christians failing to do their duty to God and his church? They felt bad about it when they first started forsaking their Christian commitment, but with continuous disobedience, this has hardened their conscience. Now, there may well have been men who envied David. Perhaps they said to each other and to themselves, "Wouldn't it be super to have all these wives?" But they couldn't have seen all the trouble that would come to David as a result. We shouldn't envy anyone, least of all those who seem to prosper by doing what is wrong. If we read his Psalms, we can see what a deeply spiritual man David was, which is why God called him a man after his own heart, and yet he had this major weakness within him that marred both his life and his witness. And so it can be in a Christian man today. He can truly love God, and yet he has to battle every day against the sin of impurity, and he doesn't always win. But he should realize that God still loves him dearly, as he did with David. But he should also realize that a bad thought can lead to a bad deed, and a bad deed can lead to trouble. Now, it wasn't only David who had this problem with women, for Abner, the leader of the opposing forces, he appears to have had a similar weakness, for he too gets involved with the wrong woman, which is where we begin this evening's passage in verse 7. This lady was called Rizpah, and she'd been one of Saul's concubines, but who was now without a man because Saul had died. And it would appear that he was frowned upon. It was always frowned upon if a woman who once belonged to a king then went with another man after the king's death. Ishbosheth, Saul's only remaining son, and now acting as king in his father's place, gets very annoyed with Abner for having a relationship with one of his father's women, and he accuses him of being immoral with her. And Abner gets very angry about this and turns on Ishbosheth. You see, Ishbosheth was only kept in his position because of Abner's support, so he was rather foolish to upset him like this. But no doubt God was working behind the scenes in this matter to cause a rift to come between David's enemies. Abner was basically Ishbosheth's friend, his best friend. He had ventured a great deal on supporting him, and unless he had proof, then his outburst must have seemed very ungrateful. Abner doesn't actually deny the charge, although he does kick up a big stink about it. You often get this when somebody is confronted with their sin, they explode into a great rage and go on about how wrong it is for people to say such things and how that other people are much worse than they are, and people forget all that they've done for them in the past. But it's all just a cover-up. They don't want to answer the allegation. Am I a dog's head, says Abner. I'd have to be like an animal to be immoral like that. It's wrong of you to suspect me of such a bad thing. Is this all the thanks I get for all that I've done for you? I have gone against David, Israel's rightful king, in order to show kindness to you and to all of Saul's relatives and friends. I've risked everything on you, and yet you're finding fault with me concerning this woman. Well, you wait. Just like in the past I did everything to help you, so now I'm going to do everything to help David. And I'll make an oath in God's name that from now on I will endeavour to translate the kingdom from the house of Saul to the house of David as God wants. Well, he was in a great rage. And of course it is when people get into a big rage that they start blurting out things which later on they wish they hadn't said. But Abner was showing how arrogant he had been to think that he alone had been the one to keep Ishbosheth on the throne. But he also showed up a greater sin, and that was that he'd known all along that God had wanted David to become king, but that he had worked against what God had wanted, and no doubt for his own earthly advantage. But what a warning this is about getting into a bad temper. People say things in a rage that normally they would never dream of saying. They would keep it to themselves. And it can lead a person to make threats which even after they've cooled down, they may feel they must carry out to save face. When anger and pride are found together, it's almost impossible to control them. Abner had refused to have David reign over him and had rejected him in favour of somebody else, but now he's going to reject that somebody else as well. And so it is with those who will not have the son of David to reign over them. They go after some other interest, but it's only for a certain time, and then eventually they will leave that as well. Over the years, we've seen several people who've left the Christian life of the world, and when they go, they say that they found something else they enjoyed much, much better. And it's not wrong, they say. But later they get fed up with that way of life as well, and they want to change again. It was Abner's ambition that made him turn against David, and now it's his pride that makes him turn against Ishbosheth. Now in verse 11 we're told that Ishbosheth could no longer speak to Abner. He was too scared to. He could have said to him, well, if that's how you feel, you go and serve David and I'll find somebody else to put in charge of the army. But he doesn't say that. He reckons he couldn't possibly succeed without Abner. And he's secretly hoping that he will stay with him after he's calmed down a bit. So he dare not say anything to upset him anymore. Well, it's sad when a relationship reaches that level, isn't it? But things can be like that even between friends, that one of them dare not say anything that might upset the other one for fear of losing their friendship. It can even be the case between two Christians, that one of them is always on their guard so as not to say anything which might make the other person take offence. And it goes without saying that this sort of thing can happen in a marriage, that one partner is so fearful of losing their husband or wife, they can no longer speak their mind about anything. And they allow their partner to get away with all sorts of things. But what this incident shows above all is how much trouble can come through a wrongful relationship between a man and a woman. For indeed, in the end, this relationship between Abner and Rizpah was to cost both of these two men, Abner and Ishbosheth, their lives. What two armies had failed to achieve, fighting against each other and losing men on both sides, was in the end brought about by one man and one woman being immoral with each other. And it proves again what we've said before, that there's no greater power on earth than that of the man and woman relationship. It's greater than all the bombs and bullets that have ever been made, and it's caused the death of more people as well. Anyway, Abner stood by his threat, and in verse 12, he decides to change sides. So he sends messengers to David saying, "Who is the land? It's yours. You're the rightful king. Make an agreement with me, and I will come over and serve you, and I will work for the joining together of the whole land under you." Well, how people can change. They can be right against you at one time, and then they want to be close friends with you another time. They can promise you their undying loyalty one day and then talk about walking out on you the next day. Some will hate thee, some will love thee, some will flatter, some will slight. Cease from man and look above thee. Trust in God and do the right. And David replies to Abner and says, "Yes, I will make an agreement, but only on one condition." And what's that? Well, surprise, surprise, it's about a woman again. Do you remember that David's first and rightful wife was Michal? She was the daughter of Saul and sister of Ishbosheth, and David appears to have had a special love for her. She left him under her father's influence when Saul had turned against David, and she'd been given to another man. And despite the fact that David had now got these 6 other wives, he wants Michal back again. In fact, the fact that she'd now lived with another man for some time did not put him off. So in verse 14, probably on the advice of Abner, David sends messengers to Ishbosheth, demanding that he return Michal to him. "After all," says David, "I had to kill 100 Philistines in payment for her, so she is rightfully mine in every way," which of course she was. David was showing Ishbosheth that he's not against him or his family. Indeed, he was under an oath that he would never kill any of Saul's descendants. And if it hadn't been that circumstances changed things, David would have been happy to have been the king over Israel and allowed Ishbosheth to be at his court. But they couldn't be good friends until Michal was restored to him, because that which was wrong couldn't be allowed to continue. It must be put right. But the man that Michal was now with, Phaltiel, he loved her very much, and he was shattered at the thought of losing her. Perhaps Michal felt the same way about him, but there was no way they could stay together anymore. And as Michal was being led away from her house on her journey to meet David, Phaltiel was so distressed that he walked at some distance behind her, crying his eyes out because the bottom had fallen out of his world. But in a sense, this was his own fault. He must have known when he first took her that Michal belonged to another man, and those who take somebody else's partner today can't complain if that finishes up in misery for them, as it so often does. People must learn not to set their heart on that which they're not entitled to. It goes right back to the very first sin, when Adam and Eve desired what they were not entitled to and took the forbidden fruit and were ruined thereby. Now in verse 16, Abner went up to Phaltiel and told him to stop following Michal. "It's over now. You've got to forget about her from now on and return home and do what you can to let it go from your heart, and be thankful that Michal's rightful husband will soon be king, and he hasn't asked for your life." And so Phaltiel realized that his case was hopeless, and he returned back to his unhappy home. Michal was then restored to David, but whereas in the past she was his only love, now she had to be content with 6 other women, all sharing David. And from what we read later on in this book, she doesn't seem to have been very happy with David. Now in the meantime, Abner speaks with all the leaders of Israel, including those of Benjamin, Abner's own tribe, and Saul's tribe, and he endeavours to bring them over to David's side, knowing that all the common people would do what they said. Abner has now changed his tune completely. For he says to these people, in time past you sought for David to be king over you. Now here is your chance. Go and do it. Make him your king. Nobody deserves to be king more than he does. In fact, he is God's choice. The Lord has spoken concerning David, that not only shall he be the king, but he will use David to drive out the Philistines from our land and conquer all our enemies. And this is all part of David's anointing. Abner is trying to show Israel's leaders that it's not only their duty to make David their king, it would be to their gain. He would lead them to victory and get rid of the hated Philistines from their land. But it's a pity that Abner hadn't said this years ago. It would have saved a lot of bloodshed and misery and would have helped the cause of Israel much sooner. It was rather like his hypocrisy in the previous passage when he'd lost the battle and he wants everyone to be friends and brothers. But he hadn't felt like that before when it didn't suit him. Now he's all for David because it suits him, but it wasn't like that before. Abner was a terrible turncoat. He kept changing his position to suit his own circumstances. May God make us Christians stand up for what is right, whether it suits us or not. Anyway, the leaders of Israel agree that they do want David as their king, and Abner and 20 other men go to see David, and David seats them down to a great feast. Whatever reason Abner had to change sides, David saw God's hand in it, for this was a glorious opportunity to unite all sides, to end the war, and for David to become king. And so David and Abner became friends that day, and Abner agreed that he would go and gather the whole of Israel together so as to crown David as king over all that he desired. And David sent him away in peace. Abner probably hoped for some high position in David's new Israel, but it wasn't to be. Now David's army, with their leader Joab, had not been there when Abner had come to make peace. They were away fighting, probably against the Philistines. But Joab returned soon after Abner had left. And he should have been pleased when he was told that the war with Israel was now over and that shortly David would be made king and that terms of peace had been agreed with Abner, so all was now well. Joab should have trusted David, knowing that he was both a wise man and a good man. But no, he really gets annoyed with David. And he says that he'd been stupid and that he'd made a big mistake. What hast thou done, he says in verse 24, as if David was accountable to him for what he did. Why have you sent Abner away in peace? He was in your clutches at last. He walked right into your trap. This was your golden opportunity to kill him, or at least put him in prison. Don't you realize that Abner is a spy and that he's only come here to trick you? He's out to deceive you and to see what your movements are. Now, this is extremely wrong of Joab to talk to his king like this. Joab was nothing before he met David, and in no way was he as wise as David, yet he more or less calls him a fool. But why was he like this? Why did he say such things? Well, because Joab was not a man of God. And although he saw David as a great man, he didn't necessarily see him as God's man, or at least that side of things didn't interest him. And as David's cause had prospered more and more, and Joab himself was the leader of the army that kept winning on all sides, he saw himself as somebody special, as if it was his cleverness that had brought all this success and not God. Such a thing can happen with a professing Christian today. They seek to go God's way in life, and in return God blesses them, and he gives them success. But after a few years, they've prospered so much that they begin to believe that it's their own cleverness that's brought them success, and that they don't really need the church and the Christian life or even God. And like Joab, it tends to make them proud and very critical of others, and they think that some of their Christian friends have made foolish decisions. Nothing is said here about David replying to Joab. It cannot be that he was scared of him, like Ishbosheth had been scared of Abner. It could be that David felt that such an outburst was so stupid that it wasn't worth replying to. Or maybe he felt that Joab was such a son of Belial that there was no point in trying to reason with him. But the most likely answer is that Joab didn't give him a chance to reply. He simply said his piece and then walked away, like a lot of evil people do when they can't get their own way. They don't wait for their lives to be examined by a truthful answer. So here now is another man in a rage, Joab. And he begins to think to himself that Abner might reckon that he'd fooled David, but he wasn't going to fool him. And anyway, he says to himself, does Abner think that he can suddenly change sides when he wants to, when it suits him? Who says we want him on our side anyway? He's killed a lot of people, including my younger brother Ashel, and I don't want him to join with us. Well, I know what I'll do. I'll trick Abner into a trap, and then I'll kill him. And so Joab sends messengers after Abner, telling him that David wanted another word with him. David knew nothing about this, and Abner suspected nothing. He thought they were all good friends now. He forgot what he previously said to Ashel. How shall I hold up my face to Joab thy brother? And now he's going to find out. And so Abner returns to Hebron, and when he gets there, Joab takes him on one side as if to have a private word with him, and when he got him off his guard, he suddenly plunged his sword into his body and killed him. What an evil man. The interesting thing is that it says in verse 27 that he smote him under the 5th rib, which is exactly where Abner had plunged the backward of his spear into Joab's brother Ashel. So this shows a degree of sowing and reaping here. It was great wickedness on the part of Joab to kill a man under a flag of truce. But having said that, Abner did deserve to die, for he'd gone against David knowing that he was the Lord's anointed, and he'd betrayed Ishbosheth, and God would not have allowed a man like Abner to prosper. On the other hand, it was wrong of Joab to make out that he'd slain Abner as revenge for his brother, because if you remember, do you remember what happened? His brother Ashel was given clear warning by Abner, turn back, don't come near me, turn back. He didn't want to kill him, whereas Joab gave Abner no warning at all. Abner had slain Ashel in self-defense, which Joab couldn't possibly claim. But Joab is like a lot of people who want to do somebody harm, and they try to find some excuse for doing it, but it's a lie. Even a boy at school beats up another boy and then tries to excuse it by saying that that boy hit his younger brother. The truth was that Joab killed Abner, not mainly because of his brother, but because he didn't want Abner to be a rival with him in David's army. Well, God willing, we shall see next time how extremely sad this murder made David and how much he despised Joab for what he'd done. Here was David about to become the king over all the tribes of Israel, and the man who'd previously represented them, Abner, had come in peace, and David's general had murdered him. What would that make the people think of David? It meant that his reign over Israel was started on a bitter note. And it's surprising that such a man of God had such an evil companion as Joab. Indeed, David could only just about control Joab even at this point, but later in this book of 2 Samuel, we can see that the day came when, because of David's sin, he played right into the hands of Joab, and from that time onwards, Joab would scarcely do anything that David told him to do. One of the very last things that David said before he died was to tell his son Solomon, who would be the next king, to make sure that Joab was put to death and not be allowed to die in peace. The warning from that is obvious, and it's taught throughout the Bible, that if men and women of God make ungodly people their close companions, they will almost certainly have to face the consequences of that in a coming day by losing out in some way or another. And there are 2 other things in verse 27 which aggravate Joab's sin. One was the fact that it was done in Hebron, which was a city of refuge and therefore gave special protection to people, so that Joab had brought a bad name upon this city because he'd done the opposite. And secondly, the fact that it says that Joab took him aside in the gate, because it was at the gate of the city where the judgment was given out and where the magistrates made decisions about people to see that justice was done. So it was in a place of justice where this very unjust deed took place. What a sad passage we looked at tonight. Let us learn from it the danger and misery and death that can come about as a result of two things that men can get themselves involved with. One is fighting and the other is womanizing. Let such things ever be far from us, and let us always be thankful for the blood of Christ that can make the foulest clean and avails for those who put their trust in him. Amen.